Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about William Rowe in one of the most popular articulations of the problem of evil. So let us begin. Rowe begins by laying down what he takes to be the main questions for the article. And there are three main questions. Here are the main questions. The first one is, does the existence of evil or suffering provide a strong enough argument to make it reasonable to believe that God does not exist? And by God, he doesn't mean any like particular God within a religious tradition like Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, and so on. He really means the philosopher's God, right? The being that is omniscient, knows everything, omnipotent, is capable of doing everything, and it's all good, right? That's the philosopher's God, which may or may not be the same God that the religious traditions also worship, and that's a separate question. But it's the philosopher's God that he's after. And the question that Rowe is asking is not whether we can prove or we can know that God does not exist. Rowe thinks that's impossible. Like all human knowledge is necessarily fallible and probable, not certain. There's nothing we can know for certain, and that's also the case for God. So his question is kind of simpler. It's much more modest. Can thinkers provide an argument beginning with the existence of evil that makes it reasonable to believe God does not exist? That's still a pretty devastating conclusion for most theists, but it's a much more modest kind of conclusion than definitively proving God doesn't exist. So that's the main question for the article. And Rowe himself thinks that the answer is yes, that he's going to provide a version of the problem of evil that is going to make it reasonable to believe God does not exist. There are other questions he's asking. And the other main question is, well, given the formulation of that persuasive argument from evil, what is the best response by the theist, right? Someone who claims to believe in God. What is the reasonable response of the theist to this problem of evil? He's actually going to provide a couple of interesting answers to this question. Then there's a third interrelated question that he's going to address. And he thinks, okay, well, like himself, for example, he's going to take the argument of evil seriously. He's going to think it shows that belief in God is not reasonable, and therefore that belief in no God is reasonable. So if you find yourself in that position, if you think the problem of evil is so persuasive that it's reasonable to believe that God does not exist, what should you think of people that believe in God? Can people believe in God reasonably, even given the presence of the problem of evil? He's going to offer three different possible answers to this question. What should the reasonable atheist think about the reasonableness of theistic belief or belief in God? He says, well, one alternative is not to think about it, right? Like you can become an indifferent atheist. You can not make up your mind about whether or not one can be rationally justified in believing in God, given the problem of evil. There are two other alternatives that are typically taken. One is what he calls the unfriendly atheist. And he, by unfriendly here, he doesn't really mean like you go and make fun of and call names and things like that, right? Like that's the more kind of common sense of the word unfriendly. What he means is that to be an unfriendly atheist is to think that belief in God is necessarily irrational and unjustifiable. In other words, given the problem of evil, one can think that the only way for others to believe in God is to do so via irrational faith, a kind of faith that gives up on reason. Belief in God is essentially irrational. If you think that on the basis of the problem of the argument from evil, you are an unfriendly atheist. The third alternative, and this is in fact William Rowe's own answer to the third question, and that's to be a friendly atheist. And now, again, by friendly doesn't mean you say nice things to people, you treat them with decency and so on. Like you should do that, right? Like we should all treat each other well, regardless of our religious beliefs. What he means is, again, is a claim about rationality. He is a friendly atheist. What that means is that Rowe thinks that it is reasonable to believe God doesn't exist. That's why he's an atheist. But he's also friendly. He thinks that it is possible for some theists, not all theists, but for some theists to be reasonable or rationally justified in their theism. In other words, Rowe himself thinks that it is possible for an intelligent and well-informed person to hold reasonable belief in God, even in the presence of his persuasive argument from evil. So he thinks both that the argument from evil can be so persuasive that you can be a reasonable atheist like himself, and also that if the stars align in the right way, we'll see that later, you can also fully endorse the strength of the argument and yet by other considerations, still be a reasonable theist. So anyway, that's the plan for the paper. So let us go in more detail. Before presenting the actual problem of evil, here are a couple of conceptual tools. Here are a couple of ideas that will emerge in the presentation of the problem of evil. So one is the fawn case. This is a case that Rowe presents. So suppose in some distant forest, lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire. In the fire, a fawn is trapped, horribly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days before death relieves it of its suffering. So suppose that is the case. And the thought here is that, like, surely that happens all the time, or at least some of the time. Like, our world is such that those kinds of incidents do occur. And here's the crucial observation that Rowe adds. As far as we can see, when we look at a case like this, the fawn's suffering is pointless, it's worthless. There's nothing valuable connected to it. It just happened, by accident. So think of that case. That's going to play a role in the argument. Here's a question related to the case. Why would an omniscient God, an omnipotent God, an all-knowing, God, how can someone that has all of those attributes allow this to occur? If this occurs, how can there be a being that is has the power, the knowledge, and the goodness to prevent it doesn't do so? In a way of like developing the terminology better, this actually does not occur in the article, but I put forth this terminology is very insightful. So think of the distinction between absorbed evils and unabsorbed evils. So first, absorbed evils. Absorbed evils or sufferings are evils or suffering that are outweighed by the greater good that is necessarily connected to it. So think of like the pain of getting the vaccine. So the pain of getting a vaccine is a kind of suffering, it's a kind of evil, it's a kind of undesirable thing that if one can go without, one would do without. But the vaccine or the pain of the vaccine is necessarily connected with some good things, like, it strengthens the immune system or something like that. So there are some long-term good health consequences of having the vaccine. So I, for example, as a good parent, I can take my 5-year-old to the doctor to get a vaccine. And I have knowledge of the pain of the vaccine and the connection with the good health benefits. And I also have the power to prevent, right? I cannot take him to the doctor. And I also have good intentions. I care for the good of my child. And yet I do allow this pain to happen, right? That the pain of the vaccine happens. It's perfectly intelligible, even though I know about it, I have the power to prevent it, and I'm a good parent. I care about the good of the person enduring the pain. Right. So when those stars align, when all of those facts are there, let's call those absorbed evil. So the evil that befalls my 5-year-old who's going to the doctor to get a vaccine is not a reason for thinking that I'm a bad parent. Why is that not a reason for thinking that I'm a parent? Well, because of the things I said. The benefit, the good connected with the pain is greater than and outweighs the pain. And the pain is necessarily connected to it. It's not like I could provide those health benefits or immunity system increases without the pain. If I could, I should do that, and then a good parent would. But I can't, right? The only way for me to provide those benefits to my child is through the pain of the vaccine. So I still come out as a good parent, right? I allow the pain to, in fact, actively bring it about. I drive him to the doctor to get the vaccine, right? So I'm an active cause in the bringing about of the pain. But it's all good, right? I'm still a good parent. The question that Rowe asks is, go back to the fawn example. Is this a case of an absorbed evil? What is the good that is coming out of this case that allows a good being to stand by and let it happen? And he thinks it's hard to conceive what such a good would be. And that gives rise to the other category of unabsorbed evils. And those are kind of the negation of the absorbed evils, right? So an evil or suffering that is not outweighed by the greater good that is necessarily connected to it. So unabsorbed evils are those evils that occur in the world, but are not absorbed by other goods that are necessarily connected to them. And it is those cases, the cases of unabsorbed evils, that are problematic for theistic belief, that I, as a parent, allow the pain to befall on my child because it's connected to greater good, is not a challenge to my being a good parent. Likewise for God, if there's an evil that happens in the world but is connected to a greater good, and God allows it because it's connected to a greater good, then God is fine, right? Like that's not a reason for thinking that God is not good or that God doesn't exist. However, if the evil is not connected by a greater good, like in the unabsorbed case, that does give us reason for thinking that God doesn't exist. But anyway, those are the conceptual tools. Here's the actual argument. So premise number one, an omniscient, omnipotent, all-good being would not allow cases of unabsorbed evils to occur. Right? That's the main premise. And here are some sub-premises that are supposed to convince you of the truth of one. 1A, an omniscient being knows about those unabsorbed evils, right? That's what it is to be omniscient, that you know everything. So you know about the existence of those evils that are not connected to a greater good that outweighs them. B, an omnipotent being can prevent those unabsorbed evils, right? To be omnipotent is to be able to do everything, so you can prevent those things. That was supposed to be 1C. But 1C, an all good being wants to prevent, right? A good intention for a good agent is to want to prevent those unabsorbed evils. As a parent, I may not want to prevent the pain of the vaccine, but because it is an instance of absorbed evils, when they're unabsorbed, that is when there's no greater good connected to them, a good parent would want to prevent, like inflicting pain or allowing pain to be inflicted upon the child for no good is a sign of a bad parent, right? That means that the parent's not doing something well. Likewise for God is the thought. So that's premise number one. Most of the action is there. Here's premise number two. In the previous case of the font is supposed to convince you of this. Probably there are cases of unabsorbed evils in the world. So start looking around. You start seeing the pain and suffering in the world. Some of it seems to be connected with some good things, and that seems to justify beings allowing those bad things to occur, those evils to occur. But there seems to be an awful lot of things that is hard to even conceive of the greater goods that are connected with those that prevent them. So it seems that probably there are cases of unabsorbed evils, say the font case that Rowe himself presented. From these two, it follows that it is reasonable to think, or it is probable that there is no omniscient, omnipotent, and all-being God. So the presence of evil seems to give us thinkers good reason for thinking that God does not exist. It makes it reasonable to think that this is the problem of evil. So what can a theist do in response? Rowe thinks the argument is so persuasive that reasonable people can accept it as a sufficient reason for believing that God does not exist. So what can a theist do in response? What can a theist do in a way to retain his rationality, her rationality in response to this? And there are two different responses. One, Rowe calls the direct attack. And this, the theist can go directly after the instances of evil. So you can see an instance of evil, like my case with vaccine, and the theist can think, oh, what would make, a good being allow that? Oh, the vaccine, the pain of the vaccine is connected to this greater good, namely the increase in the immunity of the person getting the vaccine. So like, oh, okay, good. The theists can identify the actual good that is necessarily connected with the evil and say, oh, that's the good that justifies God in permitting it, right? So that's the direct attack. It goes case by case and identifies the greater good. So that's a high bar. It must be God that is able to, God must be justified in permitting those evils by the relevant goods that are pointed by the theist. So what are some of the options for the theists? What are some of the options that some theists have put forth as the goods that allow or absorb a lot of the evils in the world? And here are some of the main ones. So divine retributive justice. Some people suffer a lot, like because they do bad things, right? So some people do horrible things and they become socially isolated. No one likes them, and things like that. And they hurt themselves. And one thing the theists have said is, well, yeah, that's bad. Like the suffering that they undergo is bad, but God is justified in permitting it because it's the consequences of their choices. And it is just for them to suffer those consequences because they chose to act in a vicious way. So divine justice permits and justifies the evil that befalls upon bad people for their bad behavior. Another one is freedom of the will. So sometimes you misuse their freedom in allowing people to act on the basis of misuse of freedom as a condition for freedom. So freedom outweighs the misuse of freedom. something like the possibility of spiritual and moral formation. There being obstacles and challenges are like required for moral formation, and moral formation is valuable. So the presence of challenges and obstacles is permitted because it's necessarily connected with the prospect of spiritual formation or even union with God. But anyway, you see the picture. The goal of the direct attack by the theist is to deny premise 2 of the previous argument, that there are unabsorbed evils, by going in a case-by-case basis and saying, oh, in this case, that's the good that God's allowing God. Rowe himself thinks that this particular response will not do. Go back to the fawn example. Rowe would say, it's extremely hard to identify any good that would permit God to do so. None of the goods on this list, for example, do it, right? Because it's a fawn, freedom of the will, justice, spiritual formation, union with God. None of those are relevant there. That's why he chose that example. And yet it seems that good God wouldn't allow that example. So that example seems to survive all of these traditional responses to the problem of evil. So Rowe concludes one cannot be a reasonable theist via direct attack. But he thinks there's a different response. There's a different response that makes a theist still be reasonable. He calls this the indirect attack. So it's a way of going after premise 2, that there are unabsorbed evils, but not directly, not by pointing to the goods that are connected with it, but rather in this weird way. Here's the indirect attack. So again, the first premise is an omniscient, omnipotent, all good being would not allow cases of unabsorbed evils, right? So the proponent of this indirect attack accepts the first premise of the problem of evil as formulated by Rowe. Then points out, or brings forth, an omniscient, omnipotent, and all good being exists. God does exist. And from these two claims, it actually follows that there are no unabsorbed evils. Why? Because God wouldn't allow those, because that's what it is to be a good God. And God does exist, therefore there are no unabsorbed evils. So this move is a weird move, but it's a way of saying, I don't actually have to know what are the goods that are connected with every case of evil. I just have to know that God exists, and that God would not allow those things for me to know that there are no such cases of unabsorbed evils. But crucially, conclusion 5 is the negation of the second premise of the argument, right? So if you can justify denying the second premise of the argument of evil, you can thereby justify not believing the conclusion, namely that it's reasonable that God doesn't exist. Hey, what about 4? 4 is kind of weird, right? Why are we bringing forth belief in God in this context? That seems like cheating. And Rowe says, well, it's not quite cheating, because if you just state that God exists with no reason, then it is cheating. But you can have good arguments, or at least think you have good arguments, like the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, religious experience, and things like that, right? So there's this wealth of arguments people have put forth for making it reasonable to believe God exists. And now those arguments are relevant, right? Because those are part of the evidence that should be assessed by a reasonable inquirer. So if you're a philosopher, you want to know the truth, does God exist, does God doesn't exist, you look at the evidence against the problem of evil and the evidence for the arguments, like ontological, cosmological, and so on, and you try to weigh those. And that's it. Like, that's what we're doing here. That's the indirect attack. If one authentically, sincerely finds the arguments, ontological, cosmological, religious experience, and so on, more plausible, more credible, more trustworthy than the argument from evil, then it is reasonable for one to be a believer. If one, on the other hand, like Rowe, finds the argument from evil more persuasive than these arguments, then it is reasonable to be an atheist. So there's this kind of uncomfortable relativity built into at the end of the model, but Rowe thinks that's how reality is. Reality is very complicated. It's hard to assess evidence. And this is a particular instance in which there are two equally legitimate alternatives. And you can be a reasonable theist or a reasonable atheist, and both options are open. Okay, let's end here. I'll see you next time. Bye.